Would you spend your last savings to help a stranger? Lena Carter did. She thought she was just spreading holiday cheer until a knock at her door revealed the truth. Because the man she helped wasn't just any stranger. And her kindness was about to change everything. The early morning air carried the crisp chill of winter as snowflakes danced gently through the quiet streets of Willowbrook, a small town where Christmas morning usually brimmed with warmth and togetherness. The scent of fresh pine and cinnamon drifted from homes adorned with twinkling lights, while the sound of distant carols echoed softly from neighborhood windows. But for Lena Carter, Christmas had taken on a quieter meaning this year. She knelt alone in the back pew of St. Matthew's Church, her hands clasped tightly together in prayer. Unlike the joyful families gathered at the front, her heart carried a different kind of hope, a silent wish for peace, kindness, and the strength to push through her struggles. Life hadn't been easy. The past few months had been filled with relentless challenges, bills piling up, job applications going unanswered, and the quiet, gnawing fear of uncertainty. But Lena wasn't the type to dwell on her hardships. She had always believed in gratitude, in finding joy in the smallest of blessings. So this Christmas, she wasn't asking for miracles. She was simply asking for the strength to keep going. As her prayer ended, she stood up and adjusted her coat, a faint but determined smile forming on her lips. She had been looking forward to today. After months of cutting back on small indulgences, skipping coffee runs, saying no to dinners with friends, stretching every dollar, she had finally saved enough for a little treat. A meal at Giovanni's, her favorite Italian restaurant. It wasn't much, but it was something. A quiet moment of comfort in a life that had felt uncertain for far too long. The thought of warm pasta and fresh bread filled her with excitement, not just for the food, but for the feeling of treating herself, even if just for a day. As she stepped outside the church, the soft crunch of snow beneath her boots was the only sound in the otherwise peaceful street. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and set off toward town, her heart light with anticipation. Then, something made her stop. Near the side of the church, away from the families exchanging hugs and warm holiday wishes, an elderly man sat alone on a worn wooden bench. His back was slightly hunched, his hands resting limply in his lap. He wasn't admiring the snow or enjoying the holiday morning like the others. Lena hesitated. At first, she considered walking past. Maybe he just needed a moment alone. Maybe it wasn't her place to intrude. But as she watched him, she noticed the way his shoulders trembled, the way he quickly wiped his face as if ashamed of his own sorrow. She couldn't just walk away. The warmth of her own Christmas plans faded as concern took over. Taking a deep breath, she approached him. "Sir, are you okay?" she asked gently, careful not to startle him. The elderly man's head lifted slightly, his weary blue eyes meeting hers. There was a brief flicker of surprise, as if he hadn't expected anyone to notice him. He quickly wiped his damp cheeks with the back of his trembling hand. "Oh, I'm fine, dear. Just memories, that's all," he murmured, his voice hoarse with emotion. But the way his voice cracked, the deep sadness lingering in his expression, it was clear to Lena that he wasn't fine. Not even close. "Are you sure?" she asked, her tone soft but concerned. The old man sighed, his fingers tightening over the edge of the bench. His lips trembled as if holding back more words, but something about Lena's presence, her quiet patience, her willingness to listen, seemed to give him the courage to speak. After a long pause, he finally whispered, "I had hoped to spend Christmas with my family, but they turned me away." Lena's chest tightened. Turned him away? He took a shaky breath before continuing, his gaze fixed on the snow-covered ground. "I went to see my son today, wanted to meet my grandson for the first time. I thought maybe they'd want me there even just for a little while." His voice wavered, filled with years of unspoken longing. "But when I knocked on their door, my son barely looked at me. He said they had other plans." His breath hitched as he let out a weak chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "He told me it was better this way, that they already had everything planned out, and that I should understand." His hands clenched into fists, his knuckles pale against his thin, weathered skin. I didn't argue. I just nodded, said I understood. And then I walked away. Lena felt her heart break. She had seen loneliness before, but not like this, not so raw, so exposed. He had hoped for warmth on Christmas, only to be met with cold indifference. "I don't even know why I came here," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "Maybe I just didn't want to feel completely alone today." Lena swallowed the lump forming in her throat. This was not how Christmas should feel. No one deserved this. Not today, not ever. She sat down beside him, leaving a respectful space but offering him something just as important: her presence. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "No one should feel this way, especially not today." The old man nodded weakly, his tired, defeated eyes looking out at the snow-covered street ahead of them. Lena sat quietly, giving him a moment to breathe, to let the weight of his sadness settle. Then an idea sparked in her mind. Her fingers brushed against her purse, hesitating for only a second. She had been looking forward to her meal all week, saving carefully for it. But suddenly it didn't feel as important anymore. She couldn't walk away from this. Not now. Not when she had the chance to change something, even if only for one person. Taking a deep breath, she stood up. The elderly man looked at her, a hint of uncertainty flickering across his face. "Wait here," she said gently. "I'll be back in just a moment." He nodded, but his expression remained hesitant. As she turned and walked toward the nearest shop, his shoulders sagged slightly. For a brief moment, he wondered if she would return at all. Lena, however, had no intention of leaving him behind. She wasn't going far, just across the street where she would find something small, something simple. Something that might remind him that Christmas wasn't about being alone. With every step she took, her heart filled with quiet determination. She didn't know how much she could truly change, but she knew one thing for certain. She was going to try. Lena walked briskly through the snow-dusted streets, her breath curling in soft clouds in the chilly morning air. The small cafe just across from the church had a warm, inviting glow, its windows fogged from the heat inside. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries drifted through the air, wrapping around her like an embrace. As she stepped inside, the bell above the door chimed softly, signaling her arrival. The cafe was nearly empty. Most people were at home with their families, wrapped in the joy of Christmas morning. Lena approached the counter, her heart still heavy with the image of the elderly man sitting alone, his eyes filled with quiet sorrow. She knew she couldn't erase the pain he felt, but maybe, just maybe, she could remind him that kindness still existed. "Good morning. What can I get for you?" The barista, a cheerful woman in a red Christmas sweater, greeted her with a smile. Lena hesitated for only a second before speaking. "A large coffee, please, extra hot. And..." Her eyes scanned the display case, where rows of fresh pastries sat, golden and inviting. One of those cinnamon rolls. The barista nodded, quickly preparing the order. As Lena reached for her wallet, a small display of Christmas cards caught her eye, bright and colorful, decorated with snowflakes, reindeer, and gold-foiled lettering. A quiet thought nudged at her. What if she left him a message? Something simple, something he could hold on to even after today. On impulse, she picked up a card with a painted winter scene, a small cabin in the woods, its windows glowing warmly against the snowy landscape. She paid for everything, the total coming to just over $50, almost exactly what she had saved for her meal at Giovanni's. But as she watched the barista pour the steaming coffee and carefully wrap the cinnamon roll, Lena didn't feel regret. Instead, she felt something different, something right. She carried the tray to a quiet corner, set it down, and carefully opened the Christmas card. Her pen hovered over the blank space for a moment before she finally wrote, "Merry Christmas. You are not alone today. There is kindness in the world, and I hope you never forget that. Lena." The words were simple but genuine. As she tucked the card neatly into the bag, she whispered a silent prayer. Not for herself, but for the stranger who needed this far more than she did. With the coffee, pastry, and card in hand, she hurried back toward the church. As Lena approached the bench, she felt a small pang of worry. What if he had already left? What if he thought she had abandoned him just like everyone else? But then, there he was. The elderly man still sat in the same place, his posture slightly hunched, his eyes distant as he watched the world move around him. His loneliness was almost tangible, like a quiet ache settling in the air around him. Lena cleared her throat gently, just enough to let him know she was there. He looked up, startled. For a moment he blinked in disbelief, as if unsure whether she was real or just a passing kindness he had imagined. "You came back," he whispered, his voice unsteady. Lena smiled, offering the warm cup of coffee to him. "Of course," she said gently. "I thought you might like something to warm you up." The man hesitated, then slowly reached out, his hands trembling as he took the cup. He held it for a moment, just feeling its warmth seep into his fingers, as if he couldn't quite believe it was meant for him. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Lena sat beside him again and placed the neatly wrapped pastry and Christmas card on the bench beside him. "I got you this too," she said softly. "I hope it makes your day a little better." The old man's gaze lingered on the small bundle, his lips parting slightly in astonishment. For a long moment he didn't speak. Instead, he just stared at the card, slowly reaching out to pick it up. As his frail fingers opened it, his tired eyes scanned the words Lena had written. His lips trembled, his eyes glistened. Then, almost imperceptibly, his shoulders shook, not from the cold, but from emotion. "It's been so long since someone has shown me kindness," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Lena's chest tightened. She had almost walked past him today. If she had, he might have spent Christmas believing that no one cared. But now, as he sat there clutching a simple card and a warm cup of coffee, he no longer looked like a man entirely forgotten by the world. He looked like someone who had just been seen. Lena watched as he wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his coat. Then, with a small, hesitant voice, he spoke again. Why would you do this for me?" Lena didn't have to think about her answer. She simply smiled and said, "Because Christmas is meant to be shared, and no one should feel alone today." The elderly man looked at her for a long time, as if trying to understand her. This stranger who had shown him more kindness in a single morning than he had felt in years. Then finally, he let out a small, shaky breath. And for the first time since they met, he smiled. The elderly man sat still, his trembling hands wrapped around the warm coffee cup as if drawing comfort from its heat. His fingers gently traced the edges of the Christmas card Lena had given him, his eyes lingering on the words she had written. He swallowed hard, as if trying to hold back the emotions welling up inside him. Lena watched him carefully, giving him the space to process the small gesture. She didn't expect anything in return. This was simply an act of kindness. But in that moment, she saw something shift in his expression, a flicker of warmth, a quiet relief, as if a weight had been lifted from his heart. She took a slow breath, then spoke softly. "You don't have to spend Christmas alone, you know." The man blinked, startled by her words. Lena hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I know I'm just a stranger to you, but I'd love for you to come to my home and share a meal with me." The elderly man's lips parted slightly as if he hadn't heard her correctly. He looked at her with something close to disbelief. "You'd invite me into your home?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lena nodded without hesitation. "Christmas is meant to be shared." He looked down at the coffee cup in his hands, his fingers tightening around it slightly. "I don't want to impose," he said softly. "You've already done so much." Lena offered him a gentle smile. "It wouldn't be an imposition, it would be my pleasure." For a long moment the man was silent. His gaze drifted past her, as if searching the distance for something unseen. Perhaps a memory. Perhaps the family that had turned him away. Then slowly he nodded. A hesitant, cautious nod. "All right," he murmured. "I'd like that." Lena's smile widened, and without another word she stood and extended a hand to help him up. The elderly man hesitated only briefly before reaching out. His grip was weak but steady as he allowed her to support him to his feet. Together they walked toward Lena's small apartment, the cold winter air pressing gently around them. The streets were quiet, filled only with the soft crunch of their footsteps on the pavement. For a while neither of them spoke, but in the silence there was something peaceful, a sense of understanding between them that words could not quite capture. When they arrived at Lena's apartment, she held the door open for him with a welcoming smile. "Come in. Make yourself comfortable." The elderly man stepped inside cautiously, as if unsure whether he truly belonged. His eyes swept the room, modest yet inviting, decorated with small personal touches that made it feel like home. In the corner stood a tiny Christmas tree, decorated with a few old but cherished ornaments. A single string of lights blinked unevenly, casting a soft glow over the small living room. The elderly man paused beside the tree, his gaze lingering on one of the ornaments, a small handmade angel with slightly chipped paint. Lena, noticing his focus, smiled. "That one was my mom's favorite. She always said Christmas didn't need to be grand, it just needed to be filled with love." The elderly man exhaled deeply, a small smile tugging at his lips. "She was right," he murmured. His gaze then shifted to a small pile of papers on a side table, partially hidden beneath a stack of books. The corner of one envelope peeked out, a utility bill stamped with "Past Due" in bold red letters. His expression subtly changed, a flicker of realization, of quiet understanding. This young woman who had extended such generosity to him was struggling too. And yet, she had spent her savings not on herself, but on bringing comfort to a stranger. Before he could say anything, Lena's voice cut through his thoughts. "Make yourself at home. I'll get us something to eat." She disappeared into the small kitchen, humming softly as she worked. The elderly man settled into a worn yet comfortable armchair, his hands resting on his lap as he listened to the familiar, comforting sounds of someone preparing a meal. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like an outsider, like a burden. For the first time in years, he felt welcomed. Lena returned with 2 steaming bowls of tomato soup and 2 small plates of sweet potato casserole. "It's not fancy," she said with a sheepish smile, "but it's warm and made with love." The elderly man took the bowl with a grateful nod. His hands trembled slightly as he wrapped them around the warmth, letting it seep into his fingers. For a moment he simply stared at the food in front of him. It wasn't an extravagant meal. There were no elaborate decorations, no grand feast, no expensive dishes. And yet, it was more than enough. It was the first real Christmas dinner he had shared with someone in years. "This is perfect," he said quietly. "Thank you, Lena." She nodded, picking up her spoon. As they ate, the conversation flowed easily. Stories of childhood Christmases, of favorite holiday traditions, of memories long forgotten. The elderly man found himself smiling, laughing even, something he hadn't done in so long that it felt almost unfamiliar. Lena listened intently, laughing at his stories, sharing some of her own. For the first time in a very long time, Christmas felt like Christmas again. And as the warmth of the meal spread through him, the elderly man thought, perhaps miracles do exist after all. The warmth of the meal lingered in the air, filling the small apartment with an unspoken comfort. The elderly man sat back in his chair, savoring the last spoonful of soup, feeling a quiet sense of peace settle over him. It had been so long since he had felt this, not just the taste of a home-cooked meal, but the feeling of belonging. He glanced up at Lena, who was still sipping her soup, her expression thoughtful yet peaceful. She had shared her home, her food, and her kindness without hesitation. And yet he could sense something beneath her smile, a weight she carried, a struggle she wasn't speaking of. He set his spoon down gently and spoke, his voice softer this time. "Lena, you've been so kind to me tonight, but I can see it. Something is weighing on you." Lena hesitated, her spoon pausing mid-air. Her instinct was to dismiss it, to wave off the question with a casual, "Oh, it's nothing." But something about the elderly man's gaze stopped her. It was filled with understanding, the kind of understanding that only comes from someone who has been through hardship himself. She exhaled, setting her bowl down. Her fingers traced the rim of the ceramic dish as she finally allowed herself to say the words she had been holding in. "I lost my job a few months ago," she admitted quietly. "And things haven't been easy since." The elderly man listened intently, nodding for her to continue. Lena swallowed, her voice growing steadier as she explained. "I worked for a big company. It wasn't perfect, but I gave everything I had to that job. I worked overtime, picked up extra projects, did more than what was expected of me, because I believed in what I was doing." She let out a small bitter laugh. And then one day I spoke up. I raised concerns about how they were treating their employees, how they were overworking people without fair pay, how they were taking advantage of those who had no choice but to stay quiet. She shook her head, a flicker of frustration in her eyes. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought they would listen. Instead, I was fired. Just like that. No warning. No severance. Just a cold email saying my services were no longer needed. The elderly man's brows furrowed, his hands tightening around his empty bowl. He had seen this kind of injustice before. Lena let out a slow breath as if saying it aloud had released something inside her. And it wasn't just losing the job. They refused to pay me the money I was owed, the last paycheck I had worked for. They knew I didn't have the resources to fight them. They knew I'd struggle just to make ends meet. And they didn't care. She gave a small, tired shrug. Since then, I've been picking up freelance work, trying to stay afloat. But it's hard. And some days, it feels like no matter how much I work, I'll never catch up. She looked down at her hands as if ashamed to admit it. That's why tonight was supposed to be special. I had saved just enough to treat myself to a small meal. But when I saw you, I knew that meal didn't matter. You needed someone more than I needed that dinner. The elderly man sat in silence, absorbing everything she had just told him. For a moment, Lena worried that she had said too much, that she had burdened him with her troubles. But then he reached across the table, his old weathered hand resting gently over hers. Lena, you've endured so much, yet you still had the strength to show kindness to a stranger. That tells me everything I need to know about the kind of person you are. She felt her throat tighten at his words, but before she could respond, he continued. Listen to me carefully, Lena. Sometimes help comes when you least expect it. His voice was filled with a quiet certainty, as if he knew something she didn't. Lena tilted her head slightly, confused. What do you mean? The elderly man gave a small, knowing smile but didn't elaborate. Instead, he squeezed her hand once, then slowly stood up. Thank you, Lena. For the food. For the warmth. For reminding me that kindness still exists in this world. She stood with him, feeling an unexpected wave of emotion rising in her chest. You don't have to thank me, she said softly. I just did what anyone should do. The elderly man gave her a look, one filled with something almost like admiration. Not everyone would have done what you did, Lena, but you did, and I won't forget it. She smiled, though she still felt uncertain about his words. As she opened the door for him, the cold night air rushed in, wrapping around them both. He turned back to her one last time, his eyes filled with something unreadable, something deep. Merry Christmas, Lena. And remember what I said. Sometimes help comes when you least expect it. Then, with one final nod, he stepped out into the night, disappearing down the quiet street. Lena watched him go, a strange feeling settling in her chest. Something told her that this wasn't the end of their story. And she was right. Because in just 1 hour her life was about to change forever. The apartment was quiet except for the rhythmic tapping of Lena's keyboard. The glow of her laptop screen illuminated the small desk in the corner of the living room, where she sat working on yet another freelance project. She wanted to rest. She wanted to sit back and enjoy what was left of Christmas night. But bills didn't wait. Her eyes flickered toward the small stack of envelopes sitting on the side table, past due notices, reminders of just how fragile her situation was. She sighed, rubbing her temples. Tonight had been different than she expected. She had planned for a quiet evening alone, maybe a warm meal to bring some comfort. Instead, she had met a stranger, an elderly man abandoned by his family on Christmas Day. And she had given what little she had to make sure he didn't feel alone. She didn't regret it for a second. But as she glanced back at the unpaid bills, a quiet weight pressed on her chest. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock at the door. Lena froze. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, her heart giving a small jolt. It was late. Too late for visitors. A flicker of unease passed through her. She wasn't expecting anyone. Who could it be? She hesitated, then stood up, padding softly across the room toward the door. Peering through the peephole, her breath caught. Standing outside was the elderly man. But he wasn't alone. Behind him were 4 men dressed in expensive suits. Lena's heartbeat quickened. Lawyers? Why were there lawyers at her doorstep? Her fingers trembled slightly as she unlatched the door and pulled it open. The elderly man smiled, a kind, knowing smile. "Good evening, Lena," he said gently, his voice warm. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I wanted to see you again." Lena's lips parted in confusion. "What's going on?" she asked cautiously, her gaze flicking between him and the suited men. One of the lawyers stepped forward, holding out a neatly wrapped envelope. The elderly man placed a hand on the lawyer's arm, stopping him for a moment. Then turning back to Lena, he spoke softly. "This is for you." Lena stared at the envelope, her hands unmoving. I don't understand," she murmured. The elderly man's smile deepened. His eyes filled with something more than gratitude, something resolute, unwavering. "You helped me when I had nothing to offer in return, Lena," he said. "Now let me do the same for you." Her hands trembled as she slowly took the envelope. The moment she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. Inside was a check, a staggering amount of money. More than enough to clear her debts, pay her rent, and even give her a fresh start. Her eyes widened in shock. I can't accept this," her voice wavered. "This is too much." The elderly man chuckled softly. "It's not a gift, Lena. It's something you deserve." Before she could protest again, he gestured toward the suited men. "These gentlemen are my lawyers. I told them about your situation, about the way your company wronged you, and as of tonight, they are taking your case." Lena's mouth went dry. Her mind reeled, trying to process his words. "Wait, what?" she whispered. One of the lawyers stepped forward, his voice calm and professional. "Ms. Carter, we have already reviewed your case. Your former employer acted illegally when they terminated you without cause and withheld your pay. We're prepared to take legal action on your behalf." Lena's head spun. She looked up at the elderly man, her voice barely above a whisper. "But why? Why are you doing this for me?" His expression softened. "Because kindness should never go unnoticed, because you deserve justice, and because, Lena, sometimes help comes when you least expect it." Her breath hitched. The words. The same words he had spoken earlier in the night. She had thought they were just words of comfort, but now she understood. The elderly man wasn't just anyone. He was Samuel Hargrove, a renowned attorney and the owner of one of the most prestigious law firms in the city. Lena felt her legs grow weak. She had spent the night thinking she was helping him, but in reality, he had been the one watching over her. Her hands tightened around the envelope, emotion swelling in her chest. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice thick with unshed tears. Samuel reached out, gently placing a hand over hers. "Then don't say anything, Lena," he said softly. "Just let us fight for you, the way you fought for me tonight." Lena swallowed hard, her vision blurring with gratitude, disbelief, and overwhelming relief. For the first time in months, she felt something she hadn't dared to feel. Hope. And as she looked at Samuel, she realized something else. The kindness she had shown that night had come back to her in a way she never could have imagined. Her world had just changed, and it all started with a cup of coffee and an open heart. Lena sat frozen in the doorway, the crisp envelope still clutched in her trembling hands. The weight of it felt unreal, as if this moment was some elaborate dream that would disappear if she blinked too hard. But the four impeccably dressed lawyers standing before her, the same ones who had just promised to take on her case, were very real. And so was the elderly man who had changed everything. She had met him just hours ago, sitting alone and abandoned on a cold Christmas morning. She had shared her kindness without hesitation, expecting nothing in return. And now, he was giving her something she never thought she'd have: a second chance. "Lena," Samuel's voice was calm, steady, warm. "Let's sit down. I'd like to explain everything." She nodded slowly, stepping aside to let them in. The men filed into her small apartment, their polished shoes tapping against the worn hardwood floor. As she closed the door behind them, she suddenly became acutely aware of her modest surroundings. Her apartment wasn't much, a tiny space barely held together by faith and sacrifice. A faded couch sat in the corner, a small kitchen table held only a half-eaten pastry from that morning, and the Christmas tree by the window blinked unevenly, missing a few bulbs. She swallowed, suddenly self-conscious. But when she turned, Samuel was already settling into the worn armchair, his gaze scanning the room not with judgment, but quiet understanding. He had already seen her past due bills, noticed the sacrifices she made, and he had still chosen to be here. Taking a deep breath, Lena moved to sit across from him, her fingers gripping the edge of the envelope. Finally, she found her voice. "I don't understand. You—" She shook her head, eyes searching his face. "You're really a lawyer? A powerful one?" A small chuckle rumbled in Samuel's chest. "I am." Lena's breath hitched. "And you're just offering to help me? Why?" Samuel leaned forward, his expression growing serious. "Because, Lena, when I needed kindness the most, you were there." She blinked. He exhaled, looking down at his wrinkled hands before speaking again. "I've spent my whole life fighting for justice," he said, his voice low but steady. "I've built a career ensuring that the right people win and that those who abuse their power face the consequences. But today, I found myself in a situation I couldn't fix." His eyes lifted to meet hers. "I sat in that church this morning alone, thinking that I had no one left in the world. That despite everything I had done in my lifetime, I no longer mattered." Lena's throat tightened. "But then," he continued, "you, a complete stranger, walked up to me with nothing but kindness in your heart. You didn't know who I was. You didn't expect anything. You just gave." A lump formed in Lena's throat. Samuel smiled softly. "And now," he said, "I want to do the same for you." Lena looked down at the envelope again, her mind still struggling to comprehend. "This money," she whispered. I can't take this, Mr. Hargrove. It's too much." Samuel chuckled. "First of all, it's Samuel." His voice was gentle but firm. "And second, you're not just taking anything. You're receiving what you deserve." One of the lawyers stepped forward. "Lena, this is not charity," he said, adjusting his glasses. "We've reviewed your case. The evidence is overwhelmingly in your favor. Your former employer wrongfully terminated you, withheld your rightful wages, and engaged in unethical practices." Another lawyer nodded. "Had they done this to anyone else, it might have gone unnoticed. But lucky for you, you've just gained the backing of one of the most respected legal teams in the state." Lena's eyes darted between them, stunned beyond words. Samuel smiled. "Lena, this check is simply a retainer fee. The first step in getting you justice. Consider it your Christmas present." Tears burned in her eyes. She had spent the past several months drowning in hopelessness, fighting alone against something so much bigger than herself. And now, in the span of one night, everything had shifted. Samuel Hargrove, the man she had met crying on a church bench, was offering her a way out. Her hands tightened around the envelope. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. Samuel reached forward, covering her hands with his own. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "Just let us fight for you." Lena nodded, overwhelmed but ready. For the first time in months, she didn't feel alone anymore. Lena had always believed in standing up for herself, but she had never imagined she would stand in a courtroom, fighting for justice. It had been months since that fateful Christmas night, months filled with legal meetings, depositions, and endless documents. But through it all, she was never alone. Samuel Hargrove had kept his word. The moment his legal team took on her case, they moved swiftly. They gathered evidence, testimonies, and financial records that exposed the corrupt practices of her former employer. The company had stolen wages, exploited employees, and silenced those who spoke up. They had expected Lena to give up. They had never expected her to fight back. And now, she stood outside the courthouse victorious. The cold air nipped at her skin as she clutched the final legal documents, the papers that confirmed she had won. The company was ordered to pay every penny they had stolen from her plus damages. Her struggle was finally over. But it wasn't just the financial victory that made her breath hitch. It was the feeling of finally being seen, finally being heard. She exhaled, her breath turning to mist in the crisp winter air. Then she turned toward the man who had made it all possible. Samuel stood nearby, his hands in his coat pockets, watching her with a knowing smile. Lena's throat tightened. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel chuckled softly. You already did. She frowned, confused. How? He took a step closer, his expression warm but firm. On Christmas morning, he said, when you offered a lonely old man a cup of coffee and a kind word. Lena felt her breath catch. Samuel continued, his eyes gleaming with quiet understanding. You didn't know who I was. You didn't know what I could do, but you helped me anyway. He glanced toward the courthouse behind them. All I did was return the favor. Lena swallowed hard, blinking back the emotions that threatened to spill over. All this time she had thought she was just helping him, but in reality he had been helping her too. She smiled, a real, full, unburdened smile, for the first time in what felt like forever. Merry Christmas, Samuel. Samuel chuckled, tucking his hands into his coat. Merry Christmas, Lena. As she turned toward the city streets, ready to start her new life, she realized something profound. A single act of kindness had changed everything. Lena walked down the snowy sidewalk, her heart lighter than it had been in months. The weight she had carried, the stress, the uncertainty, the loneliness, had finally lifted. She had fought for what was right. She had won. But more than that, she had gained something she never expected, the knowledge that kindness always comes full circle. That night, as she sat in her small apartment, she looked around at the space that had once felt like a prison of struggle. Now it felt different. It was still modest, but the air inside was warm with possibility. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. When she opened it, she found Samuel standing outside, bundled in his coat, holding a small wrapped box. I hope you don't mind one last Christmas gift, he said, a playful glint in his eyes. Lena laughed softly. Samuel, you've done more than enough. But he simply handed her the gift. This isn't about what I've done, just open it. She carefully unwrapped the package and found a beautiful leather-bound journal inside. She looked up at him in confusion. A journal? Samuel nodded. I heard you've been writing a little. Thought you might want a place to put your thoughts. Lena traced her fingers over the smooth cover, something swelling in her chest. Something new, something powerful. Hope. For the first time, she believed in a future that wasn't filled with struggle but with possibility. She smiled up at Samuel. Thank you. He returned the smile, his eyes kind. No, Lena. Thank you. As she watched him disappear into the night, she realized something. This Christmas, she had been given more than a gift. She had been given a lesson in kindness, in fate, in the quiet ways the world works when we least expect it. Because sometimes the greatest gifts aren't wrapped in ribbons or tucked under trees. Sometimes they come in the form of a simple act of kindness that changes a life forever. And this Christmas, Lena's small gesture of warmth had come back to her in a way she never could have imagined. She turned back inside, clutching the journal close. Because she knew, this was just the beginning. That Christmas, Lena Carter learned a lesson she would never forget. Kindness has a way of coming back when you least expect it. What she thought was a simple act of compassion became the turning point that changed her life. Her story reminds us that giving, no matter how small, can create ripples far beyond what we can see. A warm meal, a kind word, a moment of care. These simple gestures can spark hope in ways we never imagined. So as you go about your day, remember the power of kindness. You never know whose life you might be changing, even your own. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more inspiring stories of hope, generosity, and the incredible ways our actions shape the world. Because sometimes, the smallest gestures lead to the greatest miracles.